So let's then go to the Asian romance. It's a happy story. New rules of the language game. This is based on Asian economic growth. And this economic growth makes it possible to reinterpret the meaning of the concept of Asia, not as a story of sad story or failure, but as a success story. And to this is added a scientific basis, namely economic theory, specific East Asian economic theory or development. The story is simple. I'll show it in pictures, from rags to riches, where we had an agricultural Asia. Actually, we still have these quite contemporary pictures taken 5 years ago, somewhere in the countryside of Asia, where life used to be slow, slow, slow. No machinery, and you had animals helping you in this agriculture. And you were living in poor places, making food on fireplace. And nowadays, we have glittering, newly built Asian cities. This, as you probably know, is Shanghai, taken from the Bund to the other side, full of new glittering high-rise buildings. And where old high-rise buildings are being demolished and new ones, high ones, are being placed on their turn. No? And where history, old things which are not necessary anymore, the bad, poor history, is being pushed in rubbles on earth, and glittering golden palaces are being placed on them. These at the level, the story at the level of photos, and Mao Zedong is saying, okay, just go on for all these new changes. これも上海です。大学の名前は覚えてないんです。非常に速いスピードでいくつの大学を回らせて、ここもスピーチ、ここもスピーチ。Perhaps the Shanghai University of Law and Politics, but what can it be in Chinese? I don't remember. But one Chinese university. It's there on the campus. Okay, so Asia is redescribed, especially from the 1980s onwards. Now, 7.2% annual growth is an important strategic number, because if something grows at this speed a year, its size doubles in 10 years. And in 20 years, it becomes 4 times bigger. In 30 years, 8 times bigger. And in 40 years, 16 times bigger. It means that within a lifetime, a country can grow from a very poor level to fairly well-to-do, very wealthy level. It can happen in lifetime. And we have had countries growing by 12%, 13% a year, where things take place in 5 years. They have never lasted for very long, but we have in Japanese history, in Korean history, in Chinese history, Singaporean history, this kind of periods. So it is possible to rise from rags to the riches within a generation. And when this goes on, and one country after another enters this kind of development path and growth path, and it spreads to many, many countries, the story begins to go so that this is invincible. There's nothing that can stop the Asians from becoming rich within our lifetime. The Asians succeed in anything that they do economically. And because they grow so fast and become bigger and bigger, they will form in the future the new economic, and perhaps also political, and also cultural center of the earth. From the North Atlantic, where it used to be, to the Pacific. That's the ocean of the future. So this kind of narrative now becomes very strong. And it was based on an economic theory. This is a Japanese economic theory made by Hitotsubashi University economist Akamatsu Kaname. And Hitotsubashi is in Tokyo, a commercial university. And Ganko Keita Hatten Ron, the theory of the flying geese pattern of development, is what it is called, and known nowadays. Akamatsu started in the 1930s and continued writing in 1940s, 50s and 60s in quite many articles and books. Basically the theory stayed the same all the time. He also published in English 2 articles in the 1960s. The theory of unbalanced growth in the world economy, and a historical pattern of economic growth in developing countries. And as a picture, it is like this. It deals always with a group of countries. When you have somebody leading the group, a goose, a white goose, it is the richest and technologically most developed country. But not always the richest, but technologically it is the most developed. And it creates all the time new industries, and its growth and advancement goes on and on. And there are countries that follow, and they learn from the leader. They learn how to do this kind of manufacture, how to make cameras, how to make bicycles, how to make TVs, how to make cars, and so on. And they learn from the leader. And so the whole group goes on and on. And this is a romantic narrative, because the idea is to go upwards all the time. Akamatsu writes also about history. In the 19th century, Britain used to be the leader. It was the most technologically advanced state, especially at this time, followed by other European countries like France, Switzerland. USA can be quite well placed at Europe at this time. Germany, Sweden, there also. Russia following. India has been a place that which is rise has been expected for a century, because in India there were early signs of development already in the 19th century. They simply never developed very far. Japan and America somewhere at the bottom, and China falling at this time. And countries are divided, so, as I already said, into groups. Senshinkoku, the leader country, sometimes leader countries. Ko-shinkoku, follower countries. And then there are Shinkokoku, which mean countries that are able to grow faster than the average. It used to be the role of Germany and USA as the British period. And by the 1980s, Germany and France had more or less already caught up with Great Britain. But let's jump to the 1950s. We had USA as the leader, Western Europe and Scandinavia also quite at the top. Japan was fairly poor in 1950, but its technological level was still quite high. It was able to build all kinds of machinery and so on. Latin America was not so low. India still was expected to grow. Hong Kong, Singapore, they are somewhere. At the bottom we have the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia. Middle East was getting richer because they were oil exporters. It was needed more and more after the Second World War. And there was expectations that they can change their oil riches also to industrializations, also very few ever did. That was what was expected. The theory goes like this. We have various stages on the road of development. The first stage is the bad, difficult, dangerous stage. It transforms previously unconnected country into a Korhonen. It starts when strange, interesting or useful goods from industrialized countries are imported. The country that had not been connected before is taken as an element into the world economy. And this is often a terrible shock to the society and economy of the country. For most places it meant colonization. For countries like Japan, which started to import clothes from Britain, all Japanese cloth makers, if not all, most of them fell into poverty because they lost their market. So the first stage is difficult. Yet it is important because it introduces a new kind of culture to the country. Second stage. As decades go by, and the first stage lasts often a long time, can be decades, can be centuries. But little by little, industrial production begins in the Korhonen. Because it has comparative advantage. It has cheap wages, which often is the most important element. It's poor, so wages are cheap. It also often has raw materials because that's the way it has been developed thus far. Or at least it can buy them from an international market. And there is now exists an existing domestic market which is used to industrial cheap products. Industrially made clothing or whatever. So a market exists. Then we need also politics. Akamatsu was in favor of native capital. It has to be formed because he was using Japan as the model. There needs to be an amount of protection. So this means independence. Without independence, there is no development. And you have to raise your borders high enough to keep too strong foreign competition away. You have to help your industries in your home country. And all this requires nationalism. That your country people, fellow citizens, you have to make them want to buy things made in your own state and not foreign things. Even if the domestically produced things were worse than those made by advanced industrial countries. So politics and economics are here together. Third stage, the home industries become stronger. They sell for the domestic market, they become bigger, the companies, and are able to produce more and more. And little by little you can start exports. You don't sell to the rich countries, where consumers want very fine, refined, finished products. You sell to other poor countries. Because you have low labor costs, you can sell to other poor countries. The Japanese started to sell shoes and clothing and whatever to Africa, and not to Europe first. But exports are important because they help correct your balance of payments. All developing countries tend to go into debt in the beginning because they need to import machinery, raw materials, half-finished products, technology, so on. But balance of payments can be corrected little by little if you start exporting. And you can raise the quality of your products also little by little and become better. For this, you need to open your borders sooner or later. Because if you protect your domestic industries for too long, the people working in these industries become lazy. You must create difficulties for them by letting in imports from other countries, to force them develop themselves. Also, the third stage, if you are able to produce capital goods, goods with which you create finished goods. Basically it's machinery, but it's also technology, if you can create your own technology. This means that the production of the means of production turns the originally imported industry into a local one. Let's take cars. They used to be a European invention. Then the technology was taken up by Americans and it became a domestic American industry. And American cars feel homely for Americans. Then Japanese took the technology and now we have Toyotas, Hondas, Nissans and so on, which are part also Japanese national identity. They become their own. And now we have in China big car industry. And I have been with a Chinese to a car shop and he wanted to buy a Chinese car and not a Volkswagen, even if it was made in China, not a Volkswagen or a Japanese car. He wanted a Chinese car. So you have this nationalistic idea and identity also working here all the time. Fourth stage of development, export of industrial goods from the follower countries to the leading countries begins. Now the goods are so good, well made, that also the citizens of rich countries want to buy them. And you enter as an important player also into the world economy. And this is the system that you do. If you are in the following country, you look carefully at the industries of the leader countries, and you look that here you need lots of cheap labor. We can compete on that. There, those goods are so high technologically that we are not able to compete with them. So you pick from the leader the kind of industries where you have a comparative advantage. And usually it is the labor. And the system also is so that it is easier to pick up existing industries, whether it is TV making, or camera making, or car making, or tool making, computer making, whatever, than to develop them. And this means that the leader, who is the most advanced country, normally can stay at this position only a few decades at the most. Others are bound to catch up, because adopting is easier than developing new technologies. And it tends over time to equalize the situation, until for different reasons one country is able to get ahead of the others. Like Britain once was ahead, then USA came ahead. In the 1980s there was lots of discussion, even 1990s, well 1980s basically. Japan will reach the level of USA and go above it and become a new technological leader. Actually it did not happen because it's difficult to get by. But we'll see what happens in the case of China. It's in the future. In the leader country, you also look at the environment. And you basically have to classify your industries into two classes. Sunrise industries, as it is called in English. Shinko Sangyo, as it is called in Japanese. It means newly rising industries, where new technology is being used. And then there are sunset industries, Shayo Sangyo, which are losing competitiveness. First, well, in the 1980s, in Finland, lots of clothing was made domestically. And also in Japan, when I went to a shop, almost everything was made in Japan. Shoes and clothing and whatever. Now in Finland, we use Chinese clothing. In Japan, when you go to a shop, quite much is also made in China, or perhaps Thailand or elsewhere. So clothing industry has been a sunset industry for a long time. So leader countries are leaving these kind of industries to follower countries. And this makes development easy if you follow these steps and you know what to pick, where to help your own industrialists. Kojima Kiyoshi was a pupil of Akamatsu Kaname, who added on this structure international investment. In 1974 he published Kaigai Sokusetsu Toshi no Nihon Gata to America Gata, Japanese style and American style foreign direct investment. He published it also in English, in this article. He also called them trade-oriented and non-trade-oriented foreign direct investment. He criticized American style of investment because USA was at this time at the world top. And you had big American companies also investing abroad. For instance, car maker companies could invest to the Philippines to make cars. And this is an imaginary example. Let's follow it. They exported a very advanced industry to a developing country. This meant that the Filipino cars needed lots of parts from USA, which were expensive. Basically, you only put them together in the Philippines and sold in the Philippine market, and there was no exporting. So USA and one country and production there, and another country different production there. This did not increase international trade, and it made the balance of payments or this developing country worse, because they needed to buy parts and technology from USA all the time. Then the Nihongatan, Japanese style of investment. Japanese were not exporting their best industries, but their worst, the sunset industries. The first example was plastic flowers, which you press in small presses. Japan used to be the world leader in the making of plastic flowers, which you use for decorations in the early 1950s. But then Hong Kong became the world leader in this industry, because you can put it up easily. You don't need much investment. You need the press, and you need plastic, and you need color. But this was a situation where something was taken away from Japan to Hong Kong. And the Japanese then started from the 1970s onwards to invest labor-intensive industries to various, basically Southeast Asian countries. Could be clothing, could be many kinds of equipment making, and so on. And this increased international trade, because these industries, basically clothing, was not consumed only in the receiving country, in the developing country, but it was exported again somewhere else, basically to Northern America and Western Europe, to which places. So it increased international trade and brought, let's say, this country, let's say Thailand and Japan and USA, more closely together, because they were forming one economic trading circle. So this creates both trade and it creates integration. And integration brings peace with it. So everything goes well if you leave away your older fashioned industries to other countries. And you yourself develop new ones. And this is the economic theoretical basis of this Asian romantic story of becoming rich. Investment. 1980s, within Asia, when USA was the world leader, but within this Asian narrative, Japan was the leader. Investing old-fashioned industries to Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia also, they are coming after them, Philippines, Indonesia. China, by the 1980s, it was already entering the Western system of development, not by its own efforts, but opening its harbor cities to international investment, coming not only from Japan, but also from European countries and USA and so on. India, Vietnam, both closed still, not accepting much international investment. And there used to be discussion on Japan, followed by the Asian tigers, Asian newly industrializing countries, also called Asian newly industrializing economies, because Hong Kong was not a country. And it was also difficult to find a name for Taiwan, so economies was the great word of that time. Then you have the ASEAN 4, the bigger ones, Thailand, Malaysia, more better developing, and Philippines, Indonesia after them. And then China following them on the road to development. And India, Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Burma, somewhere on the waiting list. When will they also start on this kind of development? You also had by this time lots of private capital in the world. Lots of private capital to invest in various kinds of places. And that made it easy for these level countries to start development. It became a kind of fashion that in the rich countries where salaries are little by little rising all the time, companies sooner or later start to begin to think about investing abroad. And Asia was a very favorite destination. This also created the so-called century speak, nice slogans about the future. In the 1970s, you could hear about Japanese century. Nihon Seiki in Japan would become the leading country in the world. That actually, I saw it first time, I have seen it first time in 1973 in a Japanese text. But it ended then with the oil crisis. Then you have Taiheiyo Jidai or Taiheiyo Seiki, Pacific Age or Pacific Century. 1980, I have seen it first time. Asia Taiheiyo Seiki, 1987. The Pacific Age did not yet so much refer to Asian countries. It was more about Japan, USA, Canada, and so on. But by the late 1980s, you start to get Asia here also. But being the American element also still here, Taiheiyo basically means the American element in these slogans. 1989, Nishi Taiheiyo Jidai. You drop the Americans out and start to talk about the Western Pacific. Asia no Seiki, 1994. This is the most fashionable slogan nowadays. Asia no Jidai, Asia no Seiki. Asian century. In 1996, I also saw Chugoku Jinda Seiki, written in Chinese in a Taiwanese text. So hopes, dreams, and optimism about Chinese rise was also rising at this time. And this is all about romance. From here to somewhere in the future to becoming the center of the world. About Japan, a few words. The 1980s were the great go-go years in Japan. In the light, I think it was 1989 when the Economist newspaper, not newspaper, journal, published in Britain and USA, calculated that if you sold Tokyo with the money, you could buy the whole United States. If you sold only the compound of the Emperor's Castle in the middle of Tokyo, you could buy the whole of Canada. Land prices were so high here. It was called the bubble economy. But with the help of this kind of romantic narrative, that the future is bright, there's nothing that can stop the Japanese. You could simply, everybody believed it at the time. And prices rose and rose and rose. And debt kept piling up. Nobody was afraid about borrowing money because people were sure that you can pay everything back in the future. By 1991, it was already clear that the Japanese miracle starts to end. The problem with romances is that if you have a strong romance, there's lots of air in it, always. It is simple for a romance to turn into a tragedy. So Japan starts to leave the romantic narrative from 1991 onwards. It is in recession, which continues from year after year after year after year. And the Asian crisis followed 1997 to 1998. This really, for a while, made a return of the tragic narrative. Investors are curious people. As a group, they can be likened to children. They can believe enthusiastically into something. Then they all run to the same direction together. And when they hear about danger, then they all start to believe it is a real one. And they all stampede away. So now romances easily turn into tragedies. At this time, whole faith in the Asian miracle disappeared for a couple of years. Not for a long time, for a couple of years. Investors drew back their money. And Thailand and the Philippines and Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, all fell into problems. And so though they seem to be following Japan into stagnation. But then Japan sort of stayed into stasis in these narratives, but China has been placed into this narrative, into a new leader. Not yet so much in terms of technology, but simply because its trade volume is nowadays so big that it imports lots from Asian countries and also sells a lot to them, and its growth rate about 10% going on makes it the future new hero of these stories. The romantic narrative actually continues. Japan is here somewhere away from the structure, on a shelf. People are looking how are the Japanese doing, but well, it is actually somewhere in the same place as the Europeans are. Somewhere stable, not well, rich, long lives, good lives, cozy environment, but not very much happening. But in the rest of the Asia, this story and narrative is still going on.